So we have two other speakers in addition to myself and a discussant. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Katja Yafimava from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, who's going to be talking about the future of EU-Russia gas relations and the implications for the UK. And then we'll be hearing from Juliet Phillips, who is Senior Policy Advisor for the Clean Economy Programme at E3G, and she'll be talking about priorities for a more resilient system. And both speakers have presentations to speak to. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Rob Gross, UKERC Director and Professor of Energy and Technology at Imperial College London, who will add a few thoughts more by way of as a discussant than a presenter, and that hopefully will set the context for our discussions in our Q&A. So without further ado, I'll set the scene, as it were. And some of this is going to be familiar to you for two reasons. Firstly, that I've said it before, if you listened to some earlier UKERC presentations, particularly our energy policy review. But actually, I've said it before in the sense I first started saying it back 5 years ago, back in 2017, when we had a project in an earlier phase of UKERC, and we had published a paper on the UK's global energy challenge, where we made the argument that the UK's energy security was being globalized through its reliance on imported natural gas, particularly LNG. But what I want to use this slide for is actually to ask the question, what do we use natural gas for? What is the role of natural gas in the UK's energy system? And what are the challenges going forward in terms of decarbonisation? Because as we've more or less got rid of coal, gas is the most carbon intensive fuel in our energy mix. And to achieve our net zero targets, we need to rapidly reduce our reliance on natural gas. So what role does gas play in the energy system? And there are really three sectors that we need to look at: the role of gas in power generation, the role of gas in domestic heat, very much in the news, and we'll hear more from Juliet about that later, and the role of natural gas in industry, both as a source of energy heat and a feedstock, as we know from some of the supply chain issues that we've been seeing. But in a whole energy context, we need to think about how to replace the energy system services that natural gas provides as we decarbonize the energy system. Excuse me, where gas is a source of flexibility, a source of storage, and particularly a source of meeting interseasonal demand for heat in the winter. So we need to think about then what we're using gas for and how we can reduce gas by replacing it with other sources of energy system services. This has been very much in the news. Where do we get our gas from? And I think perhaps the UK public is more energy literate now than it was 12 months ago when it comes to natural gas. There's been much discussion about who we rely on for our gas supplies. You know, about 47% of the gas that we consume comes from domestic sources, but the other half is coming from imports. 55% of those imports, or 31% of demand, are coming by pipeline from Norway. The other large slice of the pie is in the form of liquefied natural gas, 42% of total imports and 22% of demand. And there have been some interesting changes in the geography of LNG supply over the years, really a pattern of diversification. It's not that long ago that Qatar supplied 90% of our LNG. We now see supplies from the US and Russia as being important in diversifying sources of supply into the market. So this is quite familiar, and it's through that LNG supply chain in particular that we're globalizing our gas security. So every year, Ofgem and BEIS publish the Statutory Security of Supply report, and they did this in late 2021. And they tend to focus on the capacity of the infrastructure. Have we got enough pipes and terminals and storage facilities to ensure that we can physically deliver the gas we need on the one hand, and do we have a sufficiently diverse source of supply that's such that we're not reliant on any particular supplier to too high a degree? And you may have seen in the last few days ministers talking about the fact that we don't directly get a lot of natural gas from Russia, which is true, but as Katja will explain later, that's only half the story in terms of our own gas security and price security. So as normal, the Statutory Security of Supply report says we've got enough pipes and terminals to import the gas that we need, and that we have a diverse source of supply. And we looked previously at the distribution between Norway for pipeline gas and LNG from the global gas market. And our own gas price, the National Balancing Point, or NBP, has to deliver a price signal to the market that will secure the gas that we need. And this is one of the understatements of the decade, perhaps, where the report simply says trading at the NBP has experienced unusually high wholesale prices. Like other international hub markets, the market continues to balance supply with demand by adjusting the price at which trades occur. And so security of supply is delivered through market signals. And the government is quite right to be saying that the current high price is not of their making and not within their control. It's a combination of global factors, particularly around the availability of liquefied natural gas supply into Europe, but at the same time, the geopolitical tensions and problems that exist with European pipeline supply from Russia. So we have this perfect storm of this and other factors that means we have a very tight market, and that in the sense that prices are very high. Now I've skipped a slide, I need to go back. Oh, that slide's not there. Okay, so I'm sure others are going to talk about what this means in terms of the price we're having to pay to secure the gas. And of course, it's only a week or so ago that Ofgem raised the price cap, so that consumers are going to be paying a lot more come April for their gas and electricity. And of course, one of the issues is that the gas price translates into the electricity price because gas is the marginal source of supply in the generating market. And there has been raising questions about how electricity is priced in the UK. But the net result is we have very high prices. And I'm sure Juliet will say more about that. Now, this particular graph has actually been in the news in the last 2 or 3 days, and it started with the FT carrying a report where it was taking these projections from the Oil and Gas Authority, looking at the future relationship between domestic production and gas demand in the UK. And the demand curve is taken from the Committee on Climate Change Balanced Net Zero pathway, and then the production curve is taken from OGA's own analysis and discussions with the industry. And it's showing import dependence is the relationship with the amount of domestic production versus this level of demand, and how much you therefore need to import to satisfy domestic demand. Now, and what we've been seeing certainly is that the rate of production decline has been more rapid than the rate of demand decline. But of course, the question now being asked is the answer more production? Do we need to try and find new sources of domestic production, even shale gas in the minds of some? We can come back to that in the Q&A. Whereas others are saying, well, the answer really is to maintain this reduction in demand. And the balanced net zero pathway is not easy. It's not a given that we will succeed in reducing gas demand at the rate that's shown on this graph. So we need to look as much on the demand side as we do the production side, in terms of how we are going to maintain secure supply, and perhaps not get overly obsessed with the import dependency as a percentage, because it's a smaller volume of gas being imported going forward. So finally, I just want to sort of conclude by pointing that the government's aware of this challenge, as is the International Energy Agency. In the World Energy Outlook published last autumn, they talked about problems facing countries with a high reliance on gas. Unless the transition is well managed, remaining customers of natural gas will be at risk of supply shortages or volatility during the process of phasing out supply lines or delivery. This is the challenge. How do we manage the phase out of fossil fuels? And in the net zero strategy, the government promises to manage the transition in a way that protects jobs and investment, uses existing infrastructure, and maintains security of supply and accounts for climate risk. No small order to achieve all of those things. And it did promise to consult, and we await the consultation, let alone the outcome of that consultation. But there's no doubt that minds have been focused by recent events. So that's by way of context. And as I say, most of it is probably not entirely new. What I want to do now is to turn to Katja and ask her to talk about, one of the big questions out there in terms of the short term and the longer term. What about Russia's gas supplies to Europe, and what are the consequences for the UK?
So I'll talk about Europe-Russia gas relationship, and it's very important because it will have an impact on the UK. It's already having an impact for the UK, and talk a little bit more on what it might mean going forward in terms of today's crisis, but also going further than that. Next slide, please. So what's now on everyone's mind, who's watching these events and who's following the crisis and its impact, specifically potential impact on gas flows into Europe. And we looked at this at our recent quarterly gas review, the OES. There is a link and the title on the slide. We looked at the potential impact of a military conflict in Ukraine, if there is one, hopefully there isn't, on Russian gas flows into Europe. And we consider that it's extremely unlikely that Russia will cut gas flows to Europe, even in the event of a military invasion into Ukraine. But the main risk, if the Ukrainian corridor, in the event of a full-scale military conflict, might become physically unavailable, and then Russian flows via Ukraine could be curtailed, and then there is a provision for force majeure in such circumstances. On its part, Europe is also highly unlikely to take any measures that would restrict imports of Russian gas into Europe. Would be just shooting itself in the foot. But again, if Russia were to be switched off from SWIFT, and this option has been floated around, then European buyers simply would not be able to pay for their gas under their long-term supply contracts, and that's also a criteria for force majeure clause being invoked. What's important to note here, of course, is any cutoff would severely threaten the role of gas in Europe. And of course, the role of gas in Europe is already under threat from the energy transition and from the net zero targets Mike spoken about, because although Europe might say as much as it likes that it should look for supply alternatives or alternative supplies from elsewhere, that's exactly what it has been doing for the last 10 years, intensifying that after the 2009 Ukraine transit crisis. Europe knows actually that there are no large-scale supply alternatives to Russian gas, and that really threatens the role of gas in Europe. We've done modeling for our paper, my colleagues, and this modeling suggests that depending on the amount of gas cut off, if that happens, and that's something like 100 BCM a year or even a bit more, then winter in Europe, next winter in Europe, 2022, 2023, could be anything between disastrous, and that means that industry would be switched off and power plants would be shut down, and prices would increase well above what we have this year. And the best case scenario, next winter would be more difficult than winter that we have now, 2021, 2022. So please have a look at the paper where all these scenarios are discussed in detail. Next slide, please. So here is just to talk a little bit more about the ongoing energy crisis or price crunch, and then that's very well-known graph where we see, yes, this one, thanks. And that's the graph where you see the prices skyrocketing, and you also see the forward curve, the price that the market is expected well into this year, still remaining very, very high. And that's before any kind of military conflict actually happening. That's just the expectations. That's the objective reality of very tight supply-demand balance. And it's also psychological impact of expectations, what might happen if there is a conflict. And that's all reflected in the price, which is obviously extremely high. What's important to note here that although Russia gets a lot of blame for that price hike, that's not entirely fair, and that's because Mike's just mentioned it's been a perfect storm of events, all sorts of objective events that led to such situation, and it's ultimately the European gas market model which has produced that result, the high prices in this winter, but was often neglected and forgotten that in the last decade, prices were so much lower than otherwise would have been had Europe did not liberalize its market, had the contracts still remained oil-linked, and then European customers would have been paying much more in the previous decade, whereas they hugely benefit from that model in the past 10 years. It's just the first winter when we see such an increase for all sorts of reasons. And again, another point to make is that Gazprom has honored all of its European long-term supply contracts in full, but it's been criticized heavily in some quarters for not offering more gas on the hubs, and also for not keeping more gas in its storages in Europe. It's been keeping its gas in storages in Russia, because that takes priority also under the Russian law. But again, the European gas market model does not oblige Gazprom to offer that additional gas. So where else could Europe get some more gas? It could draw more heavily on storages, and they're already about 30+% full, so they're very low. Or it can attract more LNG, liquefied natural gas, from the global market. But again, that would imply, emptying storages completely by the end of winter, and also is not much free LNG available, uncommitted LNG available on the market. And the important thing is that significant increase in supply would require like to not increased flows from Russia, which could come through the existing infrastructure, as Yamal now is not fully utilized, but also through new infrastructure when Nord Stream 2, so that's the key piece of the puzzle, also starts up. And when it starts up depends not only on regulatory compliance, but which I'll talk later, the clearance which is to be provided by the German regulatory authority. It also depends on whether there will be a military conflict, or if there will be, what sort of intensity it might reach. So the point to make here again is that crisis showed to everyone that, again, like to not, Russian gas still a backbone of European gas supply security. It provided all it could, or all it had to under its long-term supply contracts, but not more. And that's shown heavily on the balance. And that really, as any osteopath will tell you, you can't really ignore your backbone for a long time. You have to take good care of it. And that really to suggest that the politicized dialogue, as hard as it is, between Europe and Russia, which could potentially result in a sort of a roadmap, which there would be decarbonization timelines of European member states taken into account, and the UK is actually indispensable. And this crisis is a good demonstration of that. Next slide, please. And it's like just to spend a bit more time on Nord Stream 2, whether it will start, when it will start, and because the impact of its particular on how hard or how soft in terms of prices the next winter for Europe, the UK included, will be. So Nord Stream 2 is built completely. It's built in two pipelines. Both pipelines are filled with gas. Basically, they're ready to start flowing any minute, but the pipeline, from a legal perspective, cannot operate until and unless the German regulator, it's called BNetzA, has issued certification that the operator of this pipeline system is compliant with the EU law, and specifically with the EU gas directive. This procedure has been suspended, certification procedure has been suspended since mid-November, and it has not restarted yet. Suspension was made on ostensibly legal procedural grounds, but the timing of suspension appears to be political. The different scenarios, my three main scenarios, is that flows will start in the second half of this year, that certification will be granted, and that's in my view, that's most likely scenario, provided there is no conflict and there is a diplomatic resolution to the conflict around Ukraine. It's still possible a delay, so the flows would be in 2023, in which case certification suspended now will continue to remain suspended for some time, but ultimately lifted and certification granted. And again, worst case scenario for supply security of Europe would be if certification is denied. That means no flows, Nord Stream 2 halted. I believe that's only possible if there is a full-scale invasion. That would ultimately also cause protracted litigation, multi-billion euros of damages, and again, high price environment for Europe for years to come. So clear key here, which way it will go, which scenario will materialize, is political/security context, and whether and not or not there is a military conflict. And the last slide, please. On this slide, I just want to dive a little bit more into UK's own vulnerability to disruption of Russian flows to the EU, and what kind of cooperation in the event of a crisis, in the event of emergency, we might see should it come to that. As Mike said, there is obviously a connection through interconnectors with the mainland Europe, with the continent. But again, although UK dependence on Russian gas, physical dependence is very small, as this graph also from our new paper suggests, any disruption in gas supplies to the continent would cause markets, prices on the hubs to spike. And immediately, because of these physical connections through the connected pipelines to the continent, that will filter through to the UK. And it's obvious, of course, that the UK's own gas security would benefit from less tight global market and from less tight continental gas market. And again, the point to make, the only sources that are capable to increase supplies into Europe significantly in 5-10-year time frame, it's pipeline Russian gas and global LNG from all sorts of places. Again, in terms of cooperation in the event of emergency, so should the worst case scenario come to pass, which again, my personal view, it will not do, but again, should it come to pass, cooperation between the UK and the EU from a legal point of view is not compulsory, either under the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement or the EU Security of Supply Regulation. However, it's likely, in my view, that such cooperation would prevail, despite it's not a mandatory clause in either of these documents, and non-market measures would be applied in as a measure of last resort. But I guess we'll live and see. And on that, I'll like to finish. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Katja. I think one of the more sobering aspects of this is your observation that, you know, even if things remain relatively calm vis-a-vis Russia, there's already enough baked into the system, as it were, for high prices again next winter. If nothing else, Europe is going to leave this year's winter heating season with very empty storage. That's going to be difficult and costly to fill. So this gas crisis is not just for this year, it's something that might be more prolonged. And in that context, it would be great to hear from Juliet about her views on the situation and what to do about it.
Hi, everyone. So for everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Juliet Phillips. I'm a senior policy advisor at E3G, which is an independent climate change think tank. I lead our UK work on place-based transitions, which focuses on a people-centered approach to greener housing and the kind of raft of policy, political and financial changes which come with that. And I'm speaking today regarding kind of some of the key solutions which we're putting forward for a more resilient sector in the long term. And I put the link to the report which I'll be referencing on this slide here. So obviously there's many factors contributing to the energy bill crisis and the subsequent cost of living crunch, including factors which Katja just covered, as well as other domestic kind of consequences as well, which I won't be covering today. But rather I'll be zooming in on one particular area regarding the nature of our building stock, which has left UK households particularly exposed to volatile international gas prices. And as Mike kind of highlighted in the first presentation, domestic heat represents nearly a third of the gas use in the UK. So addressing this sector really does make a lot of sense in terms of rebuilding for resilience. It's kind of a well-known fact that the UK has some of the leakiest housing in Western Europe. So a lot of the energy we're using in our homes is just going straight out the windows and doors. And over 85% of our housing stock is connected to the gas grid, with many more houses using really expensive sources of fossil fuels like oil and other forms of gas. So there's a clear case for focusing on greener homes as part of that longer term solution. And the graph down on the bottom shows how, depending on how energy efficient your home is, you'll be paying a lot more for your energy bills. We did some analysis looking at the different energy performance certificates, or EPC ratings, showing that those who live in the worst rated houses, so F and G, are paying not only a lot more to begin with, but substantially more as the price cap increased as well. So this is a huge factor. And although, of course, electricity prices have also risen, that's mainly due to the gas price increase. And I've included this chart from Ember, which shows that over 80% of the rise in electricity prices is due to gas. So the faster we can kind of move forward on renewables is going to have a big difference as well. So the first priority for us for a more resilient system is more support for low-income households. This remains the immediate priority. There's no resilient society where people are having to choose between heating or eating, or not being able to do either sufficiently. And in fact, National Energy Action, one of the UK's leading fuel poverty charities, has estimated that 4.5 to 6 million households could be pushed into fuel poverty as a result of the Ofgem price hike. And sadly, the analysis suggests that the package of measures put forward by the government so far isn't actually targeted enough in scale and scope to really make sure that those households are fully protected. So our kind of first key priority in the immediate term is to address that, and a few key areas which we would be kind of pushing forward include a one-off payment to cover those full costs of the price hike for the most vulnerable and low-income households, making sure that's timely in a way which people can actually afford to pay their bills. And other measures include things like increasing the basic generosity of universal credit as a more targeted way of supporting those lower income households. And of course, there's questions around where that money is going to come from. And one solution which has been put forward is a proposed fossil fuel windfall tax. Sure, it hasn't escaped anyone that BP's profits have been very high this year, and there's been a sustained call from MPs, charities and others calling for a windfall tax. And there's a precedent for doing that. It's been done before by Conservative governments, including in 2011. And some might say it's an even more compelling case now, as the tax rate for oil and gas has significantly reduced since 2011. So the less payment going already on tax. The second priority for us is that the gas crisis should really be a catalyst for reshaping the energy system to rebuild for long-term resilience, taking a systems approach to understand the demand, supply and distribution measures needed to reduce bills and carbon emissions deeply and permanently. And of course, energy efficiency is the first step in this. The cheapest energy is that which we don't use, and energy efficiency can really help here. So E3G did some research last year, and we found that improving homes rated EPC D or lower to EPC C could save over £500 per year, which is an aggregate saving across the country of £7.8 billion, which is disposable income, which could be spent elsewhere in the economy. And there's a really strong case for this beyond climate change. So there's also real benefits for local economies, jobs, for levelling up and health as well, as there's a real strain put on the NHS each year by cold and leaky homes. And in terms of what we think is needed to get on track, investment is a huge part of the solution. We simply can't get on track without plugging the massive investment gap which we currently see. So in terms of some areas, we would be really keen to see more action. Of course, focus on low-income households is a real priority. So fulfilling some of the commitments which were included in the Conservative manifesto, including around the Homes Upgrade Grant for low-income households, as well as the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. And also the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund is a good way of reducing spending within the public sector. The second big ask is around a new nationwide energy efficiency scheme. Again, our analysis has shown that at present, around 80% of households living in or in low to middle income brackets actually have no access to the only nationwide energy efficiency scheme, the Energy Company Obligation. So addressing that gap is really important, as this represents the biggest chunk of housing emissions and also the largest number of households. Our analysis through the Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group calculates that in order to get on track for net zero, around 3.6 billion will be needed to 2025 to get on track. But as well as public funding, we also recognise a really important role for spurring further private investment, and also considering creative ways which we could bring in blended financing as well. And we think there's good opportunities through the UK Infrastructure Bank. The German KfW Bank is kind of our poster child of how to do energy efficiency loans well. For every €1 spent by the KfW, nearly €6 of private investment was spurred. So this is a really good way of building a mass market for energy efficiency retrofits, and something we would like to see the government do in the UK. And there's other measures as well, which industry players are keen to see, including things like green stamp duty, 0% VAT on retrofit measures, as this could really help to drive the market, and tapping into some of those key trigger points where people are most likely to undertake retrofits. And all of this needs to be underpinned by a broader ecosystem of measures which will help support this nationwide retrofit drive. And one key point here would be around introducing minimum energy efficiency measures for all housing tenures. Of course, this needs to be done in a fair way to make sure that people aren't being forced to do things in their homes which they can't afford, hence why the financial support is so important. But kind of without the mixture of carrots and sticks, it's unlikely we're going to be able to get over the current plateauing rates we've seen in home efficiency measures. And all schemes and regulations need to be designed with delivery in mind, working really closely with those actually delivering on the ground, so the engineers, the installers who are making this happen in practice. And this hasn't always been the case. So for those of you who are familiar with the retrofit sector, there's been a new standard coming in, the PAS 2035 standard, and installers have found this quite tricky in places in order to fulfill the requirements which come with this standard. So making sure that we work really closely with industry in the first instance, rather than bring them in at last minute, is really key. And similarly with the Green Homes grants, the rise and fall of the Green Homes grant, a really well-intentioned measure, but unfortunately the grant scheme fell short when it came to the administration. So making sure that everything is designed with delivery in mind in order to actually make sure that we're delivering on the ground with green home retrofit schemes. And related, of course, is the jobs angle. We need to make sure that we're focusing on attractive skilled jobs, and making sure that there's opportunities for SMEs in particular to access training opportunities and accreditation, which can be expensive for small firms. And finally, on this point, public engagement is also really key, making sure that people are aware of the benefits associated with green home retrofit measures, and also have tailored advice available at national standard. Currently, this is lacking. We've seen really good work being done in Scotland, but across the rest of England and Wales, there's less access to this kind of information. So increasing those services will be really key for getting on track. The next area to cover is around clean heat. And as I mentioned at the beginning, of course, electricity prices have also risen. So I appreciate this is kind of part of a longer term package of measures. But it will be really important as we make that longer term step away from fossil heating systems. And in fact, the Climate Change Committee says that around 75% of UK homes will be heated by heat pumps under a net zero scenario by 2050. So this is kind of one of those areas where we really need to focus on getting the delivery right. And the government has set some welcome targets here, but again, the challenge will be turning ambition into delivery on the ground. Heat pumps are around 3 times as efficient as gas boilers, if not higher, in certain places. And of course, there's a need for complementary energy efficiency measures to make sure that they're working in practice on the ground. So working through the Electrify Heat Coalition, we've worked closely with industry to identify a few key areas where we think in order to get on track for delivery, we need to focus. And again, good jobs comes up as a really key area for us. At the moment, there's just not the skilled engineers, plumbers and installers across the country who can actually deliver the number of heat pumps we would need to get on track for net zero. So scaling up those opportunities is really important, including with support and incentives for SMEs to getting on track, as well as thinking about further education, green apprentice schemes, things like that, in order to make sure that there's access to high quality training. And this feeds into the second point around confidence and trust. Households need to know they're going to get a good quality service and build trust in technologies which might be less familiar than a gas boiler. So this needs to be kind of communicated at a national level alongside the benefits associated with clean heat measures. Then finally, on affordability, lots of solutions which can help reduce the upfront costs of heat pumps, but also the running costs as well. So a recommendation for us is around removing the legacy policy costs from electricity bills, which can make up around 25% of the bill, which currently acts as a perverse incentive, making gas more affordable in some cases. So that's kind of been a key recommendation from industry. As well as increasing the scale of grant funding which is available, which can be tapered over time as initiatives like the market-based mechanism for low carbon heat kick in, which will help reduce technology and installation costs. And finally, really key as well for making electric heating working practices, the parallel investments in accelerating clean sources of electricity production, as well as the broader systems required to ensure that electricity is being efficiently used. So a really key area for E3G is around tapping into North Sea renewables potentials. I was looking at this graph last night and was quite astonished at the high rate of UK potential compared to the rest of Europe, nearly double that of any other country. But simultaneously, we also need to focus on the integrated and interconnected electricity grid in the North Sea and Northwest Europe, alongside a strategy for localized, smart and flexible energy systems, recognizing that big changes to a switch from gas to electricity is going to have impacts on DNOs and other systems providers, making sure that we're collaborating really closely with those actors on the ground, as well as local authorities and others, to do that planning well. And as well as offshore wind, there's also lots of opportunities for a diverse portfolio of homegrown renewables, including domestic PV and community energy. It's quite interesting to see there has been a change in the media, more supportive of these solar solutions and other things moving forward. So that's quite a positive outcome, I think, so far. Regarding kind of suggestions around the North Sea, a good line from my colleague's recent report that there's no magic gas tap in the North Sea which can be turned on in a short space of time. So we need to think about the broader energy system implications and focusing on the demand side as well as the supply side to make sure that we're working forward in a constructive way. I'll wrap up there, but thanks, and looking forward to taking questions at the end.
Very much. That was great. Okay, Rob, perhaps you could say something by introduction about UKERC, because there's been a couple of questions, observations in the chat about the nature of our funding and what we do.
Yeah, for sure, Mike. I'll also keep my comments quite brief because I'm aware that we're running a little short of time. So UKERC is a large consortium. We've got about 20 or so universities involved. We're funded through UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, so the research councils, that's EPSRC, ESRC and NERC, so that spans engineering, social science and natural science. Actually, I had some notes here that I was going to elaborate a bit on UKERC's program of work. We've got a pre-existing program that's kind of hardwired, if you like, into what we do, and that is kind of has a focus on the energy transition and the carbon challenge, but with a strong sort of flavour of energy system resilience around it as well. So it's heat, transport, infrastructural transformation, stuff at the local level, the global issue, geopolitics and society. So it's an interdisciplinary research consortium. It's publicly funded, but we're completely independent of government. Happy to elaborate further on what UKERC is, but I think I won't. For now, I'm just going to make a few observations in response to the various presentations from a UKERC perspective. I think the first thing is that when we get an opportunity to engage with this conversation, that's obviously extremely much, very much front of mind at the moment and in the media, we need to be clear about what's feasible over which time frames. There's timescales for intervention. So, for example, I'd characterize energy efficiency improvement as a medium-term solution because of the kind of the lag, even if we got the policy environment right, and that's a fairly big if, because the policy environment for energy efficiency, particularly for able to pay households, has proved really tricky. We also need to get the skills and the supply chain, as Juliet mentioned, right. And there's similar concerns about some of the other things that take a while. I think there's a question about a set of issues around market design. So we know, for example, that we've had since 2013 the presence of long-run fixed price contracts for low carbon generation. So we've had contractual interventions in the power market. We don't have anything remotely similar in the gas market. Whether or not we should or we don't have time to get into, but certainly there are questions around market design. There's also questions around wholesale market price formation, because whilst until fairly recently we were worried about periods of very low electricity prices when demand was low and renewables output was high, what we're very much seeing now is a large margin on price that's caused by the fact that for most of the time, for most of the year, gas is a price setter on the electricity. It's the marginal price that sets the price for the entirety of the electricity market, wholesale spot price, and that margin is very significant, unsurprisingly, when the price of the fuel has gone up at 1.6-fold, but currently sort of 2 to 3-fold compared to where it was at the beginning of last year. I think there's a risk that this issue becomes politicized. I get the kind of positive noises that Juliet's picked up around solar, for example, but there's also a lot of other voices in the debate that are arguing that and misinformation that comes into the conversation. For example, blaming all of this on green policies or focusing on the wrong things in renewables. UKERC's always tried to be a completely neutral broker and to counter misinformation, and that's a role that we're going to need to continue to play. And finally, is the importance of thinking about this in a transitions context. As Mike mentioned, he's been arguing for a considerable number of years the importance of thinking about gas as an infrastructure and a market in transition, and we need to think about the whole energy system in that context and try and understand all of those kind of issues in an interdisciplinary way. I'll stop there, actually, Mike, in the interests of time.
Many thanks. I mean, there are quite a few questions, and there are observations, questions in the chat, and I don't think we've got enough time to get through them all. But what I'll try and do is I'll just pick up two very quickly, which I would field, and then try and direct questions in the way of our two speakers today. Just in terms of questions that are fall within my remit, if you like. Joel Gordon asked the question about the impact of the gas crisis on blue hydrogen. And obviously, blue hydrogen production, methane, natural gas is the key input into the process. And actually, if you look at different scenarios for future gas demand, like those from the Committee on Climate Change, from National Grid and others, it is actually the development of blue hydrogen that keeps gas demand in the system. But if that gas is very expensive, it follows that any hydrogen produced from that gas is going to be very expensive. So maybe when we're looking at the relative cost of blue hydrogen going forward, we need to be considering a range of price scenarios in terms of the costing of that gas. And the other one I'd pick up on is a question that came out from an anonymous attendee around the discussion in the Telegraph over the weekend from the Tory MPs talking about lifting the moratorium on fracking. This is not really a UKERC question, but I'm also involved in another project called Unconventional Hydrocarbons in the UK Energy System, which has been looking the last 3 years at what happened with the shale gas industry and how we've got to where we are. And I would say it's really not viable or desirable to think that fracking offers an answer. Even if the moratorium was lifted tomorrow, the industry's pretty much disappeared. And my colleagues in geology, science would tell you two things. One, that the rocks are very complicated and the US is not an analog for fracking in the UK. And secondly, the requirements around predicting seismicity are very difficult, if not impossible, to meet. And the government has made it clear in response over the weekend that the science and the science challenge remains in place. I think we need to move on. Forget fracking. It's not going to be happening. And I think, as Juliet's slide talked about it, there's no quick source of increasing production of natural gas. UK offshore energies talked about, a 75% import dependence by the end of the decade if there is no new investment in offshore oil and gas. That's an issue worthy of debate. I don't think fracking is. So moving on, if I could just pick up on some questions that perhaps Katja can field. There's a question about a view of so thanks for the presentation. You said changing policy in Europe, Russia to cut gas is unlikely. Do you have a view on the likelihood of other risks you mentioned, the area being physically cut off or Russian access to SWIFT being cut off? And I know in your own analysis, you looked at the possibility of the pipeline infrastructure, for example, being damaged by conflict. So, what other factors short of measures taken by either side might result in a reduction?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, indeed, these 2 points, the physical infrastructure damage and SWIFT issues, those are problematic potentially. In terms of infrastructure damage, I mean, if there is a full-scale military conflict that obviously no one can really forecast what might happen, because if there is a war, there is a war, but again, that to me, if there is a full-scale military invasion, which I personally believe will not be, because I think diplomacy will prevail. But if there is, then that a possibility of a physical damage. What I tried to stress in the presentation, that it's neither in Russia's interest to cut supplies either through Ukraine or through any other route, even in the event of a military conflict, and it's not in the interest of Europe, for all the reasons I've outlined, to do the same. SWIFT issue, that's been floated, and I tried to follow that story. I don't sense there is much enthusiasm for that measure. And again, these kind of measures is only being considered if there is a full-scale conflict. But even perhaps there is much understanding on all sides, as far as I can tell, that would have, pretty much catastrophic consequences for all sides involved. But more formally, from a legal perspective, if you don't have the means for paying for your gas imports, if SWIFT is disconnected, that's a reason not to continue for supply to provide gas, because that gas will not be paid for unless there is an alternative mechanism is pursued. The mute.
I knew it was going to happen. Rory Brown is asking, the ethical position would be to wean ourselves get off Russian gas as quickly as possible. And so I guess it's really about the longer term consequences. As you mentioned, the European Union learned from earlier crises in 2009, for example. But this is very much, a question that, if you look at the taxonomy, natural gas is on it. So how quickly and how serious is Europe about reducing gas demand and thus dependency?
Yeah, I think even if Europe is to meet its net zero 2050 targets, it's very clear that between now and when these targets are met, there is still a significant role to play for gas as part of that transition. That's what Mike's been mentioning before, because there is objectively, whether one likes it or not, there is pretty much nothing else to plug in between before you reach that goal. And it's sort of a consensus view that full-scale doing energy transition just through electrification rather than hybrid transition, where you would see a role for gas, but not for unabated methane, but for decarbonized gas, including low carbon hydrogen, for example, that's the least expensive option. But then again, bringing again the question of what the current price surge might impact if we focus on sort of short-term phenomenon, which resulted with this perfect storm of tight supply and demand exacerbated by tough geopolitical context, then you kind of, it's one, kind of sort of thinking about it. But then if you take a longer term view, if you think that's just a temporary phenomenon, and if that issue is resolved, and then if there is a dialogue between suppliers and importers, and pretty much between Europe and all of its importers, including Russia, and for the transition period, the sort of a roadmap is developed, which kind of gives certainty to suppliers how much gas they would provide, that would reduce volatility, price volatility, that would reduce uncertainty, that would make energy transition less bumpy than it otherwise would have been, and ultimately less expensive. Again, that also big factor in all of it, if this sort of political situation sort of settled. And again, I would say today, from our observations, there are signs that it might be.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure that you would necessarily have that same consensus here about the role of gas in the transition. I think it's much more open for debate, certainly within UKERC and probably E3G for that matter. But I mean, just coming back to Juliet, I mean, there's a big question there asked by Dina about how can we meet our net carbon zero goals and help those in fuel poverty. It's about the question of affordability of the transition. It's more of this problem: how do we get from where we need to be to a future system where a lot of the positives of a low carbon future are available? It's managing that process. Perhaps you could speak to that. What would the priorities be?
Yeah, of course. And I think for us, we always put fuel poor homes front and centre about considerations here. We really want to make sure that vulnerable households are positioned to benefit from these changes, and absolutely kind of thinking through some of the particular conditions that people might face, including thinking about accessibility, availability of information, the fact that not everyone is connected to the internet, etc., etc. So yeah, really thinking through and working closely with the fuel poverty groups on that. And in fact, I think there's really goodwill and understanding around the fact that done correctly, the net zero transition can really benefit these households and can really help reduce their bills as well. We've seen some really good articles recently about how those households in fuel poverty who've undergone these deep house retrofits see significant bill savings, have warmer, healthier, comfier homes. So I think that will be where we want to position ourselves. And of course, there are upfront costs associated with that, and this is probably why the government needs to prioritise spending on these households who aren't so necessarily able to afford them, whereas things like green finance solutions might be more in the mix for many other households as well. Hence why looking towards things like the KfW style loans and the role of the UK Infrastructure Bank. But I do think it's about much more than the finance. It is also really about thinking about all those non-financial angles as well. And this also includes things like supply chain, making sure that we've got the right people at the right time to go and maintain heat pumps, going to make sure that the right standards are being met when insulation is being installed, etc., etc. So there's kind of a whole ecosystem of measures, definitely no silver bullets in the green homes area, which I think has probably been a challenge for many years now. But yeah, of course, it's such an important angle, and yeah, one we'll kind of continue to prioritise.
Mike, you're muted.
I've done it again. I know. I'm trying to manage the chat and the Q&A as things have popped up in both. But and I think there are a couple of big questions that Rob has heroically agreed to try and field, which always come up in this discussion. There was an earlier comment about getting, about nuclear, and I didn't shut it down because I didn't think it was important. It wasn't posed as a question. And as Rob has pointed out, we're not pro or anti, but there is a question about the role of nuclear. Where is that in this discussion? And secondly, the issue of when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine in a future system, how do we manage that? So these are more sort of energy system structural issues that perhaps Rob can speak to.
Thanks, Mike. I'll be I can't do justice to it in the time we've got left, but so UKERC is not an anti-nuclear organisation. I think it's fair to say that across the UKERC consortium, but also across Europe, there's a range of views on the role of nuclear. One of the things about nuclear is that in almost every country, including in this country that's relatively pro-nuclear, nuclear is just difficult in terms of new construction and new capacity. So I saw there was some debate in the chat about Germany's nuclear phase out and the role of coal, and certainly there's inconsistencies in German energy policy, as there is in most countries' energy policy. So the Energiewende combined with a 2037 phase out date for coal is problematic in terms of carbon emission reduction. I think that in the UK context, the position on nuclear is quite settled, in that it will play a role, but it will not play the lead role. And most of the scenarios for how the UK is going to meet its net zero's goal shows a very significant expansion in the role of renewables. That does give rise to a problem of what you do for an extended wind drought if you've got and when demand is high. We have some years to come up with the solutions to that problem. One of which would be to use to continue to maintain the supply and delivery of gas sufficient to meet that period of time using gas with or without CCS. Whether and how that turns out to be cost effective will obviously be affected by what happens to the gas price. It's less attractive as an option in a world where gas prices are high in comparison to some of the other possibilities than in a world where gas prices are low. But even if you're in a world where gas prices are high and you are using that option, you are still less exposed. You would still be less exposed to the impact of the gas prices than we are now, where it's providing 40% of our electricity supply and setting the marginal price almost all of the time. I'll stop because of time.
That's very helpful. It explains, of course, one of the reasons why the UK is so exposed at the moment is, we are leaning on gas in a way that perhaps other countries are not.
For everything, yeah.
For everything, and therefore, the answer is not. It's not a supply challenge to produce more gas domestically. It's about managing the role of gas and finding alternatives that reduce that overall demand, but at the same time decarbonize. So that's the kind of whole systems approach, if you like, that you get when you listen to UKERC. I'm conscious that we run over time. Obviously, this is an issue that's very much in the news and isn't going to go away anytime soon. So I'm sure we'll be talking more about it. If I could thank our speakers, Katja and Juliet, for coming along today and sharing their insights with us, and Rob for dealing with some of the really big questions, and all of you for joining in. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. There was a lively chat. And if you want to find out more about our research, visit the UKERC website.